Cambridge Interfaith Programme series on Interfaith Futures. My name is Susie. I'm a third-year PhD student in theology and anthropology at the Divinity faculty at the University of Cambridge. My research looks at revival and hope amongst Christians in the very religiously diverse Bradford in West Yorkshire. I'm a Christian, I'm a big believer in interfaith, and I'm a postgraduate member of CIP. I'm incredibly pleased to introduce my guest and friend today, Reverend Nathanael Poole, who is the Associate Leader of Fountains Church in Bradford and Vicar of St Margaret's Frizinghall. We used to work together in Bradford. So welcome, Nathanael. You can say hello now.
Hi, thanks very much. Thanks for having me.
Nathanael, I'm going to pass over to you now. So can you just tell everyone a little bit about yourself and the work you're doing and why I asked you to do this?
Yeah, so I've lived and worked in Bradford for the past 8 years, both in Bradford city centre and the inner city. And I suppose why I'm here today looking at Interfaith Futures is I've had quite a lot of contact with those of the Muslim faith in Bradford, particularly young men, both informally and more formally within a voluntary capacity at the university as chaplain. And I also have had quite significant interactions with those in the Hindu community, particularly part of the Sai Baba sect of Hinduism. And so I suppose it's reflecting about interfaith work as an Anglican minister in the city of Bradford.
And thank you so much, Nathanael. I think something that we're really appreciating in these interviews is having someone who's actually on the ground doing this on a daily basis. So thank you for that. I think from that angle, one of the questions I wanted to ask you was sort of in this moment in time, thinking about this idea of like interfaith futures. What are the most obvious things that stick out to you? Like maybe a concern that you see, and how does your work address that?
One of my concerns is self-censorship, so not being able to speak freely what you really want to ask or to express to someone of another faith. I'm thinking here particularly around Islam, not because it's felt that I'm being coerced by a government not to be able to speak freely, and yet I think we have seen a cooling effect on speech, which particularly around things that might pertain to Islamophobia. So, for instance, I was doing some research for my master's, of which I had some anecdotal conversations around the origins of the Quran, which is quite a sensitive topic. And it did feel like I was kind of flying close to the sun a little bit in these conversations, particularly when they were, and these weren't formal interviews, this were just conversations with me, with people on the streets, or people I've come into contact through the university or at church. And so I think one of the beautiful things about interfaith interactions, particularly between proselytizing faiths like Islam and Christianity, is almost to have an honest conversation. You need to get the most honest thing out of the way, which is, I would love you to become a follower of Jesus. And equally, if I've been told that the person I'm speaking to would love for me to become a Muslim. And I think it's really important to be able to have that really honest dialogue. But when there's a fear of offence, and then what could happen because of that offence, it sometimes means the conversation becomes less honest. And I think what I said earlier, that the government, I don't feel that there's not a clear legal line. there certainly is a cooling effect around speech when it comes to exploring some of the perhaps more sensitive things about Islam, which include the makeup of the Quran.
Thank you so much, Nathaniel. I think I'm just going to refer very briefly to the previous interview I did earlier today, where I said to Michael, one of the places I saw in Bradford where interfaith worked quite well was Parkrun.
Yeah,
Because
yeah.
we were doing something kind of not religious. And CIP Nathaniel is a big parkrun evangelist. So I just wanted to ask him, do you think sometimes interfaith works best in non-religious spaces?
Yeah, of course. I mean, I think there's some great examples of that within football teams, how there's I think so. Bradford City, for instance, is the fans predominantly are white British, and yet there is some affiliated kind of groups within that. They're called I can't remember what they're called, like the Bengali Bantams or something like that. You know how and they have their own flags and sit in a particular part of the football stadium. And that's I think that seems really positive thing. So yeah, I mean. Absolutely, but it's where are these third spaces? And I suppose highlighting Parkrun, that's a third space and a really good one to highlight. And Lister Park, I think, is the most diverse parkrun, which is an exciting title to have. But I suppose, I completely agree. I suppose my concern is there's not a lot of these shared spaces, and Bradford remains fairly segregated in terms of people use the language of parallel living, parallel communities, and it does. Some areas are exclusively white British, some areas exclusively South Asian, and then some more mixed. And in the areas that are mixed, this like parallel living, I think, does resonate with me. I mean, it's a phrase that has been used to denigrate Bradford. And when I hear it from outside as an accusation towards, I think, no, there's lots of things where there's lots of integration in Bradford. But when I'm honestly reflecting, there we live live values, and the way we live life seems to be very different between those who are of a white British background or just a British background and those who are from a South Asian British background.
Thank you, Nathaniel, for that. I think everyone at this parkrun needs to look out for Nathaniel and his dog collar on Christmas Day. And also, to quote back to Nathaniel, I think when we were talking about it, you used to talk about separate economies and what that looks like in Bradford. I think along those lines, we're doing Interfaith Week here, as you know, because Interfaith UK has been shut down. If you had a sort of policy maker watching this right now, and you're sort of sitting talking to them, what do you think you'd want them to know from your experience in Bradford and your work?
Well, I think religious education is so important within schools. So emphasizing that, and I've been very heartened with my own children who go to a church school have by the time that they're in year 3 have visited a church, a synagogue, and a mosque, and are able to talk about the origins of the Eid festival. I suppose the thing that I'm concerned about is we compare the best of us with the worst of them, and I'm using that word, that horrible word, them, intentionally in terms of we present all of the loveliest things of perhaps the Christian faith with all of the perhaps more tricky things, and that's just not fair. It's not fair to compare the best with the more tricky. And so I think religious education is so important to present what is the mainline faith of the majority of the adherents to that religion. And I think that's particularly true in the faith of Islam and in the UK. So religious education, would I think anything more around policy making? Are you maybe aware of the situation that happened in Batley a few years ago, where a school teacher in an education setting showed depictions of the Prophet Muhammad in a lesson, and then subsequently had to go into hiding, and is still in hiding, and wasn't backed by their school. Neither were they really backed by the government. Now, I would say that is very poor pedagogy in terms of knowing the sensitivities of a community, and yet that this person is still in hiding, I think reveals a very serious issue at the heart, and the way that it was responded to by that particular, by the school, by the police, and by the government. I think that's a very important issue. It's a tricky one. Like, what is, in terms of policy, what is hate speech? And because it wouldn't be offensive to other religions to show a depiction of their prophet, or it might be offensive. It might be offensive, but there's not the same vociferous reaction. So how? I suppose I don't really have clear answers, but I would say strongly that the way as a polity we responded to that issue seemed that there was a lot wanting, and I hope that we might respond differently now, but I'm not sure we would actually. I think maybe the situation might be a bit worse now than it was then.
I was just thinking, as you're speaking, Nathaniel, about how to engage between faiths well. And actually, when I saw it done well in your church last Christmas, when very aware that the local schools are made up of more Islamic students than Christian students, had a Christmas experience at St. Margaret's, which went through parts of the Christmas story, but in a very sensitive way. I just wondered if you could tell us a little bit more about that and why that worked, because it was very sensitively done, and we were very deliberate about not sort of trying to force one faith onto another. And yeah, how did he go about doing that?
Yeah, I mean, we got dressed up and we decorated different stations of the church. I think we had 8 or 10 stations where we told different parts of the Christmas story, and essentially it's just storytelling. I mean, it's a fascinating story. I'd love to go to an Eid experience, or to a Hajj experience where you were telling the story about that journey, or even something which talked about the pilgrimage from Mecca to Medina. I would find that very interesting. And it's new for the children. They've not grown up with these stories in assemblies or at home, and so it is. I suppose when people talk about Christmas being magical, it did feel it feels quite magical, the Christmas experience at church. So we're involved with Frizinghall School, which is probably about 95% South Asian, which is the majority of the Muslim faith. And Christmas was much better than when we did Easter. Easter's a bit more problematic in terms of interfaith conversations, even with young children, when you're thinking about issues of atonement and sin and sacrifice and Jesus and the nature of the divinity of Jesus. But Christmas I suppose it's almost a shared story as well. It's one of those places where the faiths come quite close, and we realize that we are we're a family relation to each other in terms of the way that we're related as faiths, Islam and Christianity.
I mean, I definitely enjoyed dressing up as a sheep and talking about peace across Islam, Judaism, and Christianity. I think it's important, thinking this interfaith conversation, not just to focus on Abrahamic faiths. And I think you've said that you've had interaction. I know you've had interaction with the sort of Sikh and Hindu community in Bradford. How has that been different?
It's been very different. When I I made friends with someone who was of the Hindu faith in my curacy. So it's like when you're an apprentice or a trainee vicar. And they invited me along to come and speak to their gathering, congregation, worship group. And I thought this was going to be kind of a great evangelistic opportunity. And I suppose I found myself very surprised to have the same sense of God with us as I worshipped with them as I do when I worship at church. And I suppose I wasn't drawing many great theological conclusions from that. And just anecdotally, that I just sensed that God was present as we worshipped. And as they talked about everything that I said about Jesus, it was, yeah, we know, isn't it wonderful? So, and I think that is something particular about the Sai Baba sect within Hinduism. That Hinduism and Sikhism aren't proselytizing faiths in the same way that Christianity and Islam are, or have been in their history. And so, particularly with my Hindu friends, it's almost that if they hear a good idea, yeah, they're like, yeah, we'll have that too. I have this friend's Hindu background, and I, would tell him a lot about Jesus and about my faith, and he would just agree with me, and I would get quite frustrated. And until I lived around him for over a year, and I thought, yeah, this guy is, in terms of if being a Christian, partly of the definition of being a Christian is how one lives. He lives in a more Jesus-shaped way than I do. And then he invited my family and I around for a meal, and there were shrines to other gods, quite small shrines, but the biggest shrine in the corner of his house was to Jesus Christ, which I found quite surprising. But that really opened my mind. Really, living in Bradford has made me realise that in terms of interfaith, I have had, when I arrived 8 years ago, quite closed mind, and it has really opened my mind.
So Nathanael, I'm hoping you're evangelizing people to come to Bradford so they can get a better understanding of interfaith now. I think as we come to close, just love to know what excites you about the faith future that we're sort of entering at the moment, and how that relates to interfaith.
Well, I think something that is quite exciting for anyone who has faith, and particularly theistic faith, is the kind of great experiment of the new atheists, which was quite aggressive. You would get that in conversation sometimes. People quoting the God delusion or Christopher Hitchens. That seems to kind of have died, dare I say. Maybe there'll be a revival of it, I don't know. But it's almost like those who espouse that project kind of have said it hasn't worked, and even where it has worked, it has produced quite the opposite fruits as we intended. And so I think there is this renewed sense of the spiritual, and that not being just around kind of a new age vague spirituality, actually being found in theistic faiths. I see that within Christianity. Quite a few conversations with young people who are actively exploring faith, interestingly, through social media, through just watching reels on Instagram that have then put them down a path to watching lots of Christian content. But I've also had conversations with lots of young Muslims, particularly young Muslim men, that maybe just that's who it's easier for me to have conversations with, that because of world events, particularly what's happening in the Middle East, them choosing to take their faith much more seriously and praying more devoutly. So yeah, I think it is quite an exciting time to be a person of faith.
And on that note, thank you so much, Nathanael. You've been a star. Thank you for your time.
Thanks very much.